Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Jonathan Bennett joins me. We're going to be talking about Aion, a great new blockchain that might have some good promise for the future. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Jonathan Bennett. Episode 519, recorded February 27th, 2019. Aion. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by DigitalOcean, the simplest cloud platform for developers and teams. Deploy, manage, and scale cloud applications faster and more efficiently with DigitalOcean. Sign up today and receive a free $100 credit at do.co/twit. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I'm your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, pretty close anyway, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, little projects, projects you may want to download right after this show and play with, projects you probably might be using every day and not aware of it. Joining me once again is my lovely and talented co-host, Jonathan Bennett. Jonathan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Randal, it's good to be here again.
And you're at that place that's not across the tracks from your last place, but similar, right?
It's more parallel to the tracks. We moved west across town, but yes, still in flyover country. Wave when you go by.
Okay, cool. And I am once again, as people may recognize from the video, I am once again in what we call the Tijuana kitchen set, where the magnets on that refrigerator have not moved for 3 years after being placed apparently by my roommate. I thought it was actually his fiance at the time, but apparently that was placed by them. That sounds really cool. So today we have an exciting show. We have a great show today. We have Matthew Spokes will be coming on talking about Aion. I forgot to ask him how to pronounce that, but we'll figure it out in a few minutes, I'm sure. It's a world-leading blockchain protocol designed to solve the most prevalent challenges limiting blockchain's mainstream adoption, which is scalability, interoperability, and governance. And so we'll have him on in just a couple of minutes, but I've been sort of poking through all the pages, and there's a bunch of stuff in Java, there's a bunch of stuff about blockchain. You'd think after all the blockchain shows we've done that I would know this stuff a little bit better, but basically, as I understand it, and I repeat the same amount of ignorance every time we start a blockchain show, is that it's basically a public ledger that you can now set up things like contracts in, where you say only if these conditions are fulfilled does the blockchain get transferred, or the ownership of the property gets transferred. And it requires a computationally expensive process so that we can agree that this is in fact a valid enacted piece on the blockchain. Jonathan, did you get a chance to look up the materials this morning?
I've done a little bit of looking at them, and blockchain reminds me of what they said about the laser when it was first invented. It's a really clever solution looking for the right problem to solve. And recently there was an article written by someone who I think was involved in doing blockchain, but he listed all of these 10 different things that people think blockchain can solve, and he goes through each one and he's like, no, this doesn't actually solve the problem the way you think it does. So as cool as it is, I still feel like blockchain is looking for its niche problem to solve. And it looks like what Aion is doing is they're looking at some of the challenges of blockchain, some serious problems, and going, well, how can we address this to make the whole thing more usable, to be able to actually solve problems. So looking forward to hearing about it.
Yeah. And for those of you that are familiar with Bitcoin, which is probably the oldest and best known example of blockchain, it's now at the point where even to do a transaction, you have to expend enough electricity to light up a house for a month or something. It's really, really expensive. And I think the paper you're referring to is Bruce Schneier, because I think that's the one I sent to you a couple weeks ago about this, about the insuccess of blockchain. So we'll have Matthew defend himself in just a moment. But before we do that, I have a very important message. So this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by DigitalOcean. Easily run production applications with DigitalOcean, a scalable compute platform with add-on storage, security, and monitoring capabilities. Whether you're running one virtual machine or 10,000, DigitalOcean has you covered with the flexibility to customize standard or CPU-optimized droplets. Set up SSD-based virtual machines in 55 seconds or less. Capture backups and snapshots. DigitalOcean is designed for developers. The easy-to-use control panel and API lets developers spend more time coding and less time managing their infrastructure. Use Kubernetes to improve availability, scalability, and resource efficiency of containerized apps. industry-leading price performance. Access the compute resources you need at the lowest rates, saving up to 55% compared to other cloud providers. Know what you'll pay monthly with a simple, flat pricing structure. And included at no additional cost, 99.99% uptime SLA, cloud firewalls, full DNS management, 12 global data centers, and free round-the-clock tech support. Join over 150,000 businesses, including some of the world's fastest-growing startups, who rely on DigitalOcean to remove infrastructure friction and deliver industry-leading price performance. Sign up today and receive a free $100 credit at do.co/twit. That's do.co/TWIT for a free $100 credit. DigitalOcean, trusted by businesses, loved by developers. And we thank DigitalOcean for their support of FLOSS Weekly. And now let's bring on our guest, Matthew Spoke. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Cool. And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm dialing in from Toronto, where most of our team is for the Aion Foundation.
Cool, cool. And so I gave sort of what I think blockchain is about and also what I know about Bitcoin. Why don't you give us the 30,000-foot view? What problem are people solving when they're reaching for the stuff that you're producing? And also, how do you pronounce it?
Yeah, it's pronounced Aion. I don't think I had anything to defend because I don't think you were being too unfair about it. I think to a large extent, that's very much the state of the industry today. Very interesting technology that's being developed where the use cases and applications are still theoretical to a large extent. There's some stuff that's starting to happen that's pretty interesting, the concepts around decentralized financial systems. But if you want to think very simply about a blockchain, this is a distributed network of computers that essentially operates as a single operating system so that you can run software and applications on the backbone of a global network of connected computers instead of like relying on a cloud provider or some sort of centralized company to provide that infrastructure for you. And that has all sorts of implications as to how you might build businesses and what those businesses might be able to do without the censorship of a centralized infrastructure in the back end.
Chain evolved since the original Bitcoin implementation. Were there contracts in the original Bitcoin?
No, I mean, Bitcoin is a lot simpler of an architecture by design, and I think it's a big part of the reason that Bitcoin is so has such lasting power is that its intended design 10 years ago is still its intended design today. So Bitcoin doesn't see itself going through a lot of technological changes. It very simply it works as a system of value storage and a system of transfer of large amounts of value. There are criticisms as to its design, as to whether it's worth the trade-off, but I think to a large extent, it's proven kind of resilience, which is exactly what you want when you're building a new global financial system. The new blockchain systems that are being built, like Aion and others, are starting to layer on how do you build additional logic on top of these systems so that you can start running more intelligent applications beyond just financial transactions. So that's where you start getting into smart contracts, which essentially are the layers of logic that you'd build into an app. That could be anything as varied as, if we use simple internet analogies, can be anything as varied as ride sharing to, potentially eventually doing like video streaming on top of these technologies.
Now, as I was reading through the documentation, I was seeing that you were actually, your network provides a way of actually interpreting Java bytecodes. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the big gaps that we've been focusing on, the Aion Foundation as an organization that I lead is focused on the research and development of the underlying protocols. So what needs to be true for these protocols to be more usable and available for kind of mainstream software developers. And one of the things that we kind of kept running into is that it was a very inefficient and kind of broken, high friction process if you were a software developer that wanted to build an app on top of a blockchain. And part of that was language availability, part of that was performance, and just available tooling and infrastructure. So we went down this path of building Aion off of call it tried and true technology, specifically the Java virtual machine, the ability to kind of interpret Java bytecode as the contract layer so that you can write logic into these smart contracts using Java. And what that gave us that's quite different than most other blockchain protocols is the fact that Java engineers can use 90 to 95% of the workflow that they're already familiar with, and the tools and Java libraries that they're already familiar with that just kind of work for the purpose of writing applications on top of a blockchain. If you go down the other path, most blockchains have kind of either tried to invent their own language, invent their own tools, invent their own infrastructure. It's a very broken user experience. So our target market is the software developer that is looking for a place to build their next app, essentially.
And how complex can these apps be that are eventually powered by the Aion network?
Quite complex. I mean, the interesting thing about these apps, quite differently than the apps that you might think about, is that publishing an application on top of a blockchain means that it's by design an immutable piece of logic. So it's very difficult to change, if not impossible to change. So you have to think very long and hard about what types of applications and what types of logic do you want to be completely immutable. So financial systems is one area where you're getting a lot of interesting applications. We have applications being built in this, the term being used in the industry now is DeFi, which kind of short form for decentralized finance. And DeFi is mechanisms that, people are building smart contracts that essentially replicate the logic of derivative systems, credit systems, equity systems, but all of these things built as applications or smart contracts on top of public blockchains. But then you could also go the other way, and you could do anything that's non-financial as well, and just simply use the blockchain as kind of a computing layer to execute any type of logic on any type of application.
Now, one of the things Bitcoin is suffering from is the fact that it now takes, unless you provide some Bitcoin incentive to close the transaction, it's now taking minutes or hours to complete something. Is Aion going to eventually suffer from that too?
Well, we're solving a very different problem than Bitcoin. And I think, depending on how you view Bitcoin, you can see it as an inefficiency, or as you can see it as like a purposeful part of the design. I mean, Bitcoin's selling feature is not its speed and efficiency. It's censorship resistance and its resiliency. And so the trade-off to develop censorship resistance and resiliency is a very complex system of consensus that has a trade-off of performance. But it's a matter of evaluating if I want to, with confidence, send any amount of money around the world without the ability for somebody to step in and censor that transaction. Maybe I'm willing to take that extra cost, whether that's a financial cost or a delay cost. I mean, if you really put Bitcoin in parallel to its alternative, and its alternative today being, international banking transfers, Bitcoin is a, rocket speed system compared to the alternative. So it's by no means perfect. And this is where we're starting to see new technologies getting built as layers above the Bitcoin network. So you can start thinking about the Bitcoin network as kind of a base layer settlement system. And there's technologies like the Lightning Network that are a little bit more faster transactions that would essentially do higher volumes of transactions on top of Bitcoin and then settle lump sums down to the Bitcoin network. So I think you'll see efficiencies designed in that way, instead of thinking about how do you change the Bitcoin network. The Aion system is intended to be a very different purpose. I mean, it's a smart contract operating system, meaning we've designed Aion to be a computing platform, not a payments platform. Doesn't mean you can't build a payment application on top of it. We're a computing platform on which you could build a payment application, but we're also a computing platform on top of which you could build anything else, a data storage system or a video streaming system or something else. So it's a lot more general purpose. So the design considerations and the engineering that got us there are quite different than the architecture of Bitcoin.
So there still has to be some sort of incentive for me to run the software in the cloud to actually help power the Aion network. Is there the equivalent of Bitcoin mining for Aion?
Yeah, there is today a function of mining in the Aion network, and that's going to be something that gets migrated out over time. And with decentralized systems, one of the big kind of nuances of updating the software to change like the mechanism of financial reward is that we can't arbitrarily do that. We need the miners of our system to agree with us. So we propose software improvements, software upgrades, and then the network essentially has to agree by upgrading. So we do have an intention, and we are designing right now a new system loosely referred to as proof of stake instead of proof of work, which is a different function for securing the system. That's going to become kind of the economic engine of the Aion network in the short term.
I think one of Bruce's complaints in the paper that I was referring to at the big opening was that Bitcoin is pseudonymous. Anyway, you can take an address and trace all of its transactions, because each transaction has to have that same shared ID, and that's how we know there's like a big pile of Bitcoin that's never moved anywhere. Some of the early stuff has just never moved anywhere at all, and we're all wondering if that's that the inventor's name, Satori, whatever his name is sitting on it waiting for the right day or something. I don't know, but do we have better privacy protection in Aion?
So Aion's core design is not exclusively focused on privacy. We are building mechanisms so that people can embed privacy into the apps that they build. So, you think of a smart contract system like Aion, if Bitcoin is a single layer, Aion is designed with 2 layers, and those 2 layers are the base layer economic engine. That's the Aion kind of consensus, the Aion coin that incentivizes participation. But then above that is this layer that is our virtual machine that people can build logic on top of and build applications. At the virtual machine layer, we're building functionality so that people can embed privacy into their apps, but it's not embedded into the base layer protocol. And the reason for that is that a lot of the designs behind these economic systems are essentially powered by confidence in the underlying assets. So the ability to see the assets on a network like Bitcoin or see the assets on a network like Aion essentially provides people with a degree of confidence as to what's underpinning this economic value. So I think there's a good reason for it. There are systems that are very much optimizing towards privacy, systems like Zcash and Monero and Grin and others, that their core design is privacy. But I actually think that 99% of the use cases that we have as regular mainstream people do not require that kind of deep privacy. A lot of the use cases for privacy tend to either be when you're living in an environment where you're subject to like an authoritarian government that you're trying to like get around government controls, or illegal activity. And not to say that there's not a good use case for censorship resistance when it comes to like authoritarian governments, but it's just not the core design of the Aion network, and we've kind of left that to other protocols to solve.
Hey, Matthew, my turn to jump in and ask some questions. So
yeah, of course.
We've kind of danced around smart contracts, with I think Ethereum being maybe the shining example of that. And you talked about the idea of immutability. Springs to mind one of those urban legends. It's not just urban legend, it really happened though. The DAO, where someone wrote a smart contract and had some malicious code in it. And that was a mess where they were trying to clean that up. Does Aion have any sort of a system to prevent malicious code in contracts, or a way to clean it up afterwards?
No, I mean, malicious code is so. These systems are designed to execute code exactly as the code was written. The malicious nature of the code is if you made a mistake writing the code. So there's no, again, you have to think about what does it require to build a really decentralized system. It means you can't have a layer or an authority that essentially says, this contract's allowed into my system and this one's not. The side effect of that is that you have really, really interesting immutable applications, but the bad outcomes of that is that some of those applications you may not want to exist on the network. And that's kind of one of the trade-offs in the decentralized kind of context. The DAO was an unfortunate situation of, one, it helped us develop better practices around how to build applications and how to write smart contracts. And every time somebody makes a mistake like that, it's just going to solidify, the templates and best practices that we use for future software development. But no, Aion is not designed to be able to censor these types of things. And the ability for the Ethereum community to unwind the DAO to a certain extent the way they did, these networks are immutable, insofar that the consensus wants them to be immutable. So if the consensus agrees to go back and change something, then the network can be changed. But it's as solid as the consensus. So the larger and more decentralized these networks are, the more difficult it becomes to change these types of things. And it's also worth pointing out that at the time of the DAO, Vitalik was extremely outspoken about the fact that people forgot that Ethereum was still very much in its infancy. It still is today. So is Aion. So, to imagine that there's errors being made on top of these systems is very natural given the state of the technology. So, people were starting to treat this as like a fully production-ready environment when everybody building it was kind of putting out warning signs saying, hey, we still haven't figured out all the edge cases of the things that might go wrong. So I think that's the type of thing that'll get better over time as we get smarter at how to write smart contracts.
And then one of the other stories that just recently has popped up in the news is with Bitcoin. I believe it's Bitcoin. They are starting to see a problem where one entity can control 51% of the network. And again, it's the same thing. They've got consensus. Then they can go back and rewrite history. Double spend things. And then particularly with Aion's proof of stake, does that same problem exist there?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of this is being designed into new forms of consensus algorithms. I think, there is absolutely a risk in a lot of proof of work networks, but the reality is that depending on your motivation, if you own, let's say 51% of the Bitcoin network, which is quite difficult because again, these networks are very, very transparent. So it's you can't do it without it being noticed. The other thing is that you can't go historically change information without people catching on, because people at that point have, there are thousands and thousands of people that manage what we call full nodes of the Bitcoin network. So they might not be participating in mining, but they absolutely are maintaining their own version of the database. So it's not like you can't like secretly go and change a historical transaction and hope that nobody catches or nobody clues in. So the irony is that if you were really, really vested in the Bitcoin network and you wanted to go change a historical transaction to your benefit, you would be killing the market's confidence in Bitcoin, and by default killing the value of Bitcoin, and then the hack that you just did would become worthless because you would have essentially proven a vulnerability, led the currency to essentially an irrelevant $0 value, and then you'd be left holding a bag of Bitcoin that's worth nothing because you went and hacked the system that no longer is worth anything. And so I think there's enough game theory thought through in these systems to address those things, that the incentive to go try to like quote unquote steal Bitcoin is essentially reversed. You wouldn't want to do it because in the process of doing it, you would render Bitcoin valueless. So that's a lot of the designs. I mean, earlier networks like Aion and other smart contract systems like Ethereum, we absolutely have to consider these things in our designs. And a lot of that is the type of work we're doing on game theory, consensus algorithms, and just different cryptographic primitives that we're working with to try to solve and address some of these issues at scale.
Is Aion planning on an ICO of some sort in the future, or has it had one?
Yeah, Aion did a fundraise at the end of 2017, which is what launched the project very similarly to the Ethereum project. So we did a fundraise in 2017. We raised $23 million to fund the research and development that we're doing up to this point.
And that fundraise was through selling tokens of some sort?
Yeah, selling future commitments of tokens on the public Aion network.
Okay. And do you have anything yet, any services on the network that actually use those tokens yet?
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, the Aion network's now been live since April. We have a pretty healthy and growing group of companies that are building applications and tools and software products on top of Aion, and people that use it, for transactions and that send it back and forth as kind of like a means of value. It's growing every day, but we probably have, I'd say, in the low hundreds of like actual live use cases, and tens of thousands of people that hold Aion and transact over the Aion network. But obviously still very much a nascent thing. For these technologies to be meaningful at some point is going to require, tens, if not hundreds of millions of active users on top of these networks, whether they're even aware of it or not. I think the most interesting applications are going to be the ones that hide the underlying blockchain from the user, where it'll be just buried in the back end of how an application is kind of built and run. But yeah, we're well on our way.
And so what's the funding model going forwards? How does Aion continue to make money, the company?
So Aion is a nonprofit foundation, not too dissimilar from the Linux Foundation or the Ethereum Foundation for that matter. So we're a research and development group. We're about 75 or 80% researchers and engineers we have 3 offices in Shanghai, Barbados, and Toronto, 55 people across the team. And the funding that came into Aion back in 2017 is what's funding us to date. I mean, we had some benefit over the course of that time period where we were funded primarily in Bitcoin and Ether, and then the prices of Bitcoin and Ether appreciated after we raised money. So 23 million turned into more than 23 million. And then we've managed our treasury quite well, and we've made intelligent investments to make sure that we still have cash in the bank. And so, long term, there's a couple of mechanisms that we can foresee. One, the Aion Foundation continues to hold a lot of Aion on its balance sheet that we have not sold or distributed. So there's a potential scenario where we distribute more Aion that is part of the limited supply, part of the fixed value of how many Aion are minted. But we own a large percent of that on our balance sheet for future use. And then secondly, if we were to go down the path of how the Linux Foundation operates, at some point when you start seeing large companies using and relying on your technology in their own businesses, then there might be a model at some point in the medium term where we start looking at like membership fees for participating technology companies in the same way that the Linux Foundation charges. But we're not anywhere near that yet. I think we're sooner going to be funding ourselves off of cryptocurrency, reserves essentially.
So how did this get started? You guys just, and how did you get involved with blockchain?
I have a little bit of a, unorthodox background in this industry. I'm a CPA by background. I was working at Deloitte when I first started paying attention to Bitcoin back in 2012. And I helped Deloitte kind of venture into this space, helped them start a research and development arm focused on Bitcoin originally in Toronto, and then stumbled across the Ethereum community that was very, very early that had started in Toronto. This is where Vitalik was and where the white paper was first kind of discussed in meetups. And so we got closer to that group. And then after a few years of helping Deloitte run their Bitcoin and blockchain R&D operation, I left and started a company at the beginning of 2016 to focus on the enterprise kind of applicability of Ethereum. So it was a company called Nuco, and we were working on an Enterprise Ethereum implementation. Essentially, how do we take Ethereum and put it into large companies as a new mechanism for counterparty transactions and things like that between banks or between large manufacturers and a supply chain. And then in the process of building that company, I helped found something called the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is still today the largest industry association in the industry that I'm on the board of directors of. And it's a group of enterprises, about 600 or so, that use Ethereum in some way, shape, or form. The larger the company, the more it's kind of experimental, and there's some small companies in there actually building real products. But then in the process of becoming very familiar with Ethereum and building that business, we kind of came to two realizations. One, the enterprise market was a long way out from really being ready for adoption at a large scale. Two, there was an irony in the sense that some of the technology's promise was actually to disintermediate some of these enterprises. And then thirdly, we were losing confidence over time that Ethereum was going to evolve fast enough to meet the needs of the market. So we started focusing on designing components of a protocol originally to propose to the Ethereum community, and eventually those became like the building blocks of a new protocol that became Aion at the beginning of 2017.
Now, one of the things that happens here, since, like I said, more towards the beginning of the show, is like, I understand you programmed this in Java and the Java bytecode. You're somehow involved in implementing the contracts. What if there's a 0-day found in the JVM? Does that affect your security?
No, and even the JVM itself is actually, long-term, because we had to essentially build an interpreter around the JVM so that we wouldn't touch the JVM itself. So you can use kind of any JVM implementation. We know that the IP in there is Oracle's. But what we're doing essentially is we're saying, hey, if you want to write a smart contract that executes down to Java bytecode through the JVM, there's a layer of interpretation that needs to happen because blockchains require a certain amount of determinism in how applications are written, and you need to introduce new concepts into the language like addresses and accounts as part of the native way that you write smart contracts. But over time, we actually see that the JVM is potentially something that could be replaced, and what we call the AVM, it's the Aion virtual machine, is the layer that we built kind of sitting above the JVM, continues to be that interpretive layer. But there's a way for us to kind of reduce the dependency on the JVM over time. Today, what we wanted to optimize for was we wanted to make a very, very obvious path. Java continues to be the world's largest community of software developers. I think it makes up something like 15 to 20% of software developers in the world use Java, which is the largest of all the languages. And we wanted to just make it easy for these engineers to kind of migrate into this space without having to relearn tooling, relearn language, all that stuff. Because we were starting to see a lot of limitations with the major smart contracting language in the Ethereum world is called Solidity, which is very, very high level and very, very limited in its ability to actually write applications.
Okay, and we have a question from the chat room here. Y Guy is a regular watcher of the show. Is there anything in it for us individual users, or is it mostly an enterprise mid to large biz thing?
No, absolutely not. I mean, most of these systems are being built right now. The applications that we're seeing being built are mostly, small companies and/or hobbyist developers. I think most of the interesting use cases are being built not by the enterprise, but by, average entrepreneurial software engineers. And that's kind of the target market we're going after. I mean, that being said, there is a lot of interest coming out of the enterprise market, but enterprises tend to think inside the box that they're familiar with, right? They know how they run their business today, and they think about, well, can I take that same business model and transcribe it onto a new technology. And I think what's more interesting is using something like a blockchain to define completely new business models. And I think that's more likely to come from like that individual software developer or that, that small company rather than from a large bank or a large technology vendor or something like that. So, we're mostly talking to independent software developers when we go out and we're publishing documentation and tutorials. We've got a lot of information on how to get started. And so for one, we'd love to get more feedback on that because that's a big part of the on-ramp or onboarding process for new developers that we want to make sure we get right.
And walk me through a couple of typical scenarios because we've been really abstract for the first 40 minutes of this show. I really want to say what does somebody practically do with this today? What's been implemented, and how is using Aion better than the predecessors?
Let me answer the first question first. So I'll give you a couple of examples of stuff that's being built right now. So we have, there's a company that we work with that's right now piloting their product out of Miami. It's a company called Velocia. Velocia built a essentially incentivized reward system for public transportation, and they're working with the city of Miami and the Miami-Dade County on essentially how do you incentivize people to not get in their car, but to ride public transit, ride their bike, ride share, or do something other than drive their own car. And they wanted to create this mechanism of essentially distributing economic value to people that were doing these behaviors. And so they could use this at scale to reduce congestion and reduce traffic. So Velocia built a system built on a token called the Velo token, which is essentially a coin built on top of Aion. And it's being used to incentivize certain positive behaviors in the citizens of Miami. And they're piloting it right now with a small subset of that population, and then the intent is to kind of roll it out across the entire city. So the logic that powers that application of Velocia is built on top of Aion. The token itself, the definition of that monetary supply, how many Velo tokens exist, et cetera, all of that software is written on top of the Aion system and uses the AVM to kind of to power it. And so the AVM, again, is the fact that they could write that application using Java and using Java tools that they're familiar with as a traditional software engineering company. So that's kind of the general, a simple example. We have another company, completely different field out of Tel Aviv, working on a gaming tournament where you can say, hey, look at me play Clash Royale. And if I win certain points in my game, then those points get transcribed into a tournament, and I can accumulate points and win money in that tournament. And so they're building a token called the Good Game token, and the Good Game token is essentially a tournament system that sits on top of common mobile games. So Clash of Clans, Clash Royale, they're working on a Fortnite integration right now. And this is like the ability to bet on my performance in the game in some sort of secondary tournament market, if that makes sense. So we've got, a couple dozen of these examples. I think where Aion differentiates from Ethereum, because both of those examples could exist on Ethereum as well, is the process and workflow of a software developer getting started. We wanted to make the experience a lot easier. We wanted to make it a lot more familiar, and we wanted to use software frameworks that people were already familiar with and that were already well proven with 10 to 15 years of kind of historical industry traction. So that's where we ended up on the JVM and the Java ecosystem as kind of our differentiator, as well as the way that our JVM operates means that you can actually process transactions a lot more efficiently. And those transactions essentially end up being function calls in your application. So if it's slow, if the transaction performance is slow, then it makes your application slow. And so building a more performant virtual machine was a critical part of making Aion more kind of mainstream ready.
Well, so now I'm thinking, just to play devil's advocates on the transit example. Why would I want to get something with the volatility of a virtual coin rather than just getting paid in cash?
So volatility is not inherent to every virtual coin. Volatility is, dependent on the design of these coins. There are many coins in the cryptocurrency industry that are starting to be known as stable coins. And stable coins essentially have the characteristic where they peg the value and they peg the supply to some sort of real world value. And so similarly with Velo and a lot of the stablecoin projects out there, they're building their economic systems into their coin, and they're designing the software for their application to peg, hey, one coin equals $1 for example. And there's ways to design your applications to allow that, because then as demand fluctuates, then you need the ability to kind of impact supply to maintain like a stable value. Because if there's a secondary market, then the demand kind of dictates the value of the coin. So if you have increasing demand and you want to keep stability, then you need to be increasing supply. So depending on the design of the application, you can play around with those types of components. So at the base layer with Aion, we say, hey, it's a completely defined and finite supply, meaning that over time it becomes there's a deflationary effect, because more demand leads to a higher value over time. But at the application layer, you can build your coin to be whatever type of logic you want. You can say, hey, every time there's increased demand, I match that demand with increased supply to make sure that it maintains a stable value in the secondary market. And you essentially architect stability into your asset.
I know that the governments of the world have been sort of looking into Bitcoin, trying to figure out how they get their VIG. Have you already had that sort of experience with Aion?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a number of conversations. We're present in 4 different jurisdictions and have had a number of conversations with different government and regulatory agencies in all the jurisdictions we operate in. I think there's still a lot of education that needs to happen. In the U.S., you'll see that the SEC has become a lot more active. Similarly, in Canada, where most of our team is, the regulators here are starting to ask the right questions. I mean, a lot of it comes down to the nature of your technology. And where we're at today is that if we build this thing to be a really community-owned and community-driven technology, then we actually aren't the owners or stewards of what we're building. We're just kind of the ones designing and then publishing. But the Aion technology is owned by the collection of individuals who run our network. So it's very difficult to come after the Aion Foundation as kind of like the owner or responsible party. We're just kind of the steward responsible for our research and development. But the software itself could continue to exist with or without us because it's already published. So it's a very different concept that the regulators have a hard time wrapping their head around, is this idea of decentralization. It means that there's not necessarily an individual party to kind of go after. That being said, we take a lot of pride in the fact that there's no rules in this industry, so we've been trying to dictate our own voluntary rules. And some of these rules include the Aion Foundation has been the first of the global blockchain projects to voluntarily publish our financials twice now over the last 2 quarters, and we're going to be doing it every quarter moving forward. And nobody's asking us to do this, but we think it's just the right thing to do because we have a community of supporters that kind of expect us to be responsible with the funding that they gave us. So, using these types of things, we can start to influence positive behavior and then hopefully put the minds of governments at ease that we're, primarily good actors in this industry and that the bad actors have been flushed out with the turn of the market last year.
Could I build the next Coinbase with this to move currency between other currencies?
You could build, yeah. So there's a lot of new development happening around the concept of decentralized exchanges. And so most exchanges that you'd be familiar with today, Coinbase included and Binance and others, are centralized by design. And a lot of the promise is that you can start decentralizing that trading engine. The reality today is that it's expensive and it's slow. So it's technically feasible, and there are some companies that have done it. But it's nowhere near as efficient as going through kind of a high-frequency trading engine like a centralized exchange would provide. So I think we still need a little bit of time to make those designs more, suitable alternatives to what currently exists in the market today.
And are there financial institutions that are stepping up to say we'll talk about running the Aion network so that we can get money into and out of hard currency?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really long sales cycle to try to convert a large financial institution on a new technology like this. It's also not our primary focus. We're more inclined to go work with the entrepreneur that wants to build the future banking infrastructure rather than work with the bank that wants to do some sort of modernization exercise. We've done projects like that in the past. We've worked with a number of North American banks historically in our old company. What we found was a lot of the applications that they were building were pretty low value. They weren't really that exciting. They weren't really that transformative. And they were generally back office optimizations, and they weren't really thinking about how to improve the lives of their customer. And so most of the interesting financial applications that we've seen coming out of this industry are not coming from the banks. They're coming from startups. And I'll say that with the caveat that JP Morgan Chase just recently announced that they're now in the process of designing their own coin to be launched as a cryptocurrency sometime in the next year or two. So, at the very least, it shows a positive turn in sentiment where large enterprises like JP Morgan could start taking this technology seriously. I think it'll lead to a shift in people's perception of the industry.
Hey, Matthew, one of the things I see on your website and some other places, decentralized internet. What are you guys doing with the decentralized internet? What's your plans there?
Yeah, so I think the broader context that powers a lot of this industry, philosophically, is this idea. We often refer to the term as the Web 3.0, and it's this idea that the internet by design still has some limitations and still has some some failures, I'd say, in terms of like the original promise of what the internet was supposed to be versus what it became today. A lot of it is a concentration of power within a certain number of monopolies, whether they be Facebook and Twitter or Google and Amazon or whoever these entities are. We started off by building this technology to create kind of openness and fairness, and essentially what we did is we created the world's largest monopolies, in history. And I think where we see a push and a trend is that there's a social consciousness growing around what trade-off do I give up when I interact with Google, when I interact with Facebook, when I interact with other companies of this scale. And sometimes it's a data privacy trade-off. Sometimes it's just like an autonomy trade-off. And I think it's becoming more top of mind for people. What we're saying essentially is that blockchains as a core infrastructure, Aion specifically, become a really, really good engine to re-architect how the internet works and to re-architect how the different roles of different actors on the internet kind of interact with one another. And most of the internet today, and this is an age-old conversation about what's wrong with the internet's design, but what had been missing in a lot of these conversations, when you hear people like Chamath Palihapitiya, or you hear others that are like, lead thinkers around the brokenness of the internet, the challenge they always had is they didn't have a proposed solution. So they would complain about what was wrong with the internet, and the only solution would be, let's get governments to step in and enforce rules of privacy on large corporations like Google. That's not a suitable solution because the technology is evolving way too quickly. So we see the blockchain and this idea of decentralization being a new kind of base layer for the internet to exist over the course of the next couple of decades. And so it changes a lot of the interactions and possibilities of what business models would be enabled. One of the big challenges with the internet today that we want to address is the fact that most businesses are built around ad-supported models, and ad-supported models essentially mean that they're manipulating you to get more data out of you so that they can sell that data to advertisers. And we don't even know, for the most part, that we're entering into these subconscious agreements with our internet providers. And I think it's a matter of flipping the internet's architecture on its head and saying, hey, can we design an internet that incentivizes a better business model than ad-supported advertising or ad-supported content? And so, we're actually hosting a conference in October called Rebuild, and Rebuild, the broader theme beyond just talking about blockchains is how do we rebuild the internet, and how does rebuilding the internet lead to better outcomes for society?
Have you guys done any work with a replacement for DNS? On a technical note, DNS is one of the problems with a decentralized internet. Have you looked at that yet?
Yeah, we're in the process now of working on something that we've been calling ANS, the Aion naming service, which is, it borrows from a lot of the functional characteristics of DNS, but we're hoping will solve some of the limitations or challenges that people have with DNS. And there was a similar project that was launched in the Ethereum ecosystem about a year or two ago called the Ethereum naming service that still had some limitations that we're trying to address. But yes, absolutely. I think if you look through kind of the stack of the internet in terms of like the different protocols that people interact with, most of the time unknowingly, there's a whole bunch of things that need to be rethought, and DNS is definitely one of them. So, it's not something that we're exactly focused on at the Aion Foundation, but we are working with teams that are working on that as kind of a layer above the Aion protocol. Because the way we view this is that the Aion protocol will become one of the base layer protocols, and then people will build subsequent protocols that get stacked on top. And a naming service would probably be one of those protocols that gets built on top of Aion.
Now, Matthew, when it comes to cryptography, cryptocurrency, are you one of the folks that are saying that winter is coming? Is there a crypto winter coming, and what are you guys doing about it?
I think we're deep in the winter right now, and I don't think it's a negative thing. I think what's happened over the last 4 or 5 months, the crypto markets have essentially imploded. But what it's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to kind of separate who's here for the long term, who's working on the right problems, and who's doing this for the right reasons. There was a lot of opportunistic fundraising that happened last year and the year before. And I think, we've had a good opportunity to clean up the industry on the back of kind of a massive downturn. I think cryptocurrencies are absolutely here for the long haul. which ones specifically we'll see. Time will tell, and technology will will help differentiate which ones are working on interesting problems and which ones are not. But yeah, we're definitely deep in that winter stage. But we're pretty optimistic that it's not going to last forever.
And then what can we look forward to for the future from you guys, short term, long term? What's coming?
Yeah, so Aion's next couple of months look like, so the Java stuff that we were just talking about that Randal was mentioning right now is still functioning kind of in a public test environment. It's moving into our production system in Q2, so that's a big milestone for us on the engineering side. We have two kind of major implementations that we're working on, one out of our Toronto office, one of our Shanghai office, to make sure that there's a duplicate of the Aion software, one written in Java and one written in Rust. These become essentially redundant systems, one or the other, just to add kind of resiliency and security to the network. The other thing that's kind of coming up as an event that's a big milestone for us, as I said, is the Rebuild Conference, rebuildconference.org, being hosted in Toronto at the end of April. A broader discussion around kind of what's wrong with the internet, what needs to be solved, and how does blockchain technology potentially address some of those problems. And then we have a research paper that we're in the process of publishing that's going to define the future roadmap for the Aion project, including what our transition away from mining and proof of work looks like and how we intend to scale the network long term. So all of these things are coming up in the next couple of months.
Have you been getting a lot of contributions outside the Aion Foundation to the code?
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, there's two kind of layers. Core contributions, I'd say, we have a little bit. I think where we have the majority of our contributions is on tooling and supporting infrastructure. So we've done 25 or 30 different kind of tools and pieces of infrastructure that sit on top of the Aion network, whether those be wallets or node hosting infrastructures or different pre-built libraries for smart contract developers, and all of those are built by third parties that are contributing into our program. So one, we have third parties that contribute just for the fun of it voluntarily, but we also manage a pretty generous grant program so that developers can kind of look at some of the problems that we're intending to solve and apply for a grant to help us solve it. And so that can be found at the Aion Network website as well, aion.network, and people can find where to jump in. So all of that work has been done by third-party entities or independent developers that just want to participate. The goal with the core protocol is to start migrating to a more inclusive development process where right now you have a lot of the interesting smart people working on these problems all have their own protocols that they're working on, and we're starting to see a lot more convergence. So there are layers of our stack where we're starting to collaborate with other projects, where something like our virtual machine, for example, is a generic component that could be relevant not only to Aion, but could also be relevant to other projects. And so on layers like that, we're starting to collaborate with others, on coordinated development efforts. All of it being done open source, so nothing restricting people from jumping in.
Yeah, I just jumped in. What license and why?
Depending on the component, most of our software is licensed MIT, with the exception of anything that we're building that has kind of historical roots in GPL v3. So generally the principle behind how we decided on our license strategy was as permissive of a license as possible without freaking out large enterprise users. So if a larger institution wanted to start, adapting or changing some of the software that we built in a way that was not too restrictive, we heard a lot of feedback that in those large institutions there's some pushback or allergy to GPL. And not being a licensing expert myself, we kind of took best practices off of the Linux Foundation, where there's a huge push towards Apache and MIT licensing. So we ended up kind of pushing towards MIT as our license of choice, unless we're confined to a pre-existing license on a code base that we're working on.
Well, I definitely appreciate that too. I always consider the BSD style and MIT style licenses to be a lot more commercial friendly, because we don't have to worry about infections of our proprietary code against the public code. We're almost out of time. Is there anything we didn't ask that you want to make sure our audience is aware before we have to let you go?
No, not at all. I mean, we'd love to hear more feedback from people that can start playing around with some of the tools that we've published. We've been doing a lot of work around Java tooling, plugins for IntelliJ and Eclipse, and the Maven build tool and Gradle. And so if you're a Java engineer and you want to kind of, take a spin at building blockchain applications, we'd love to hear your feedback on your experience working with those tools. They can all be found at the Aion documentation on our website.
Cool. And I usually ask a couple questions of the programmers, but I think you're more of a non-programmer type? I
am not a programmer. Yeah, you've probably you've read through the lines. Like I said, I'm a CPA by background. I think I've become dangerously able to speak about these things without actually being able to do any of it.
You have people for that. You have people for that ones and zero moving around stuff. Cool. Well, Matthew, it's been wonderful having you on, and I wish you success in promoting the Aion Foundation, the Aion Network, and hopefully this will be the next generation of things that make things really cool in blockchain. So thank you for coming on the show. Thanks so much, Randall and John. All right, cool. So that was Matthew Spoke talking to us about Aion Network. What do you think there, sir?
I think a place like Aion are some of the guys that are going to really find the places that cryptocurrency and blockchain makes sense. And it sounds like they're trying to build some things up from the ground up, learning from the mistakes of the past and trying to make it usable. And so if there is a future to blockchain, which I suspect that there is, it'll be someplace like Aion that really comes up with the killer app or the killer collection of apps that really puts it together and makes it work. It was a good interview, super interesting, and looking forward to seeing what they come up with in the future. The killer framework, I think, is probably what you're looking for there. Yeah, cool. So let's talk about who's coming up because we're almost out of time here. So next week, Megalix, they were on the list on the show for a while, and then they didn't respond to my mail. I think it's because they went into their spam folder. But it's a Kubernetes smart manager. It gets insights about utilization and resources distribution in a few minutes and get recommendations, control when and how to apply the recommendations. Following that, the Flexera open source report, which is the annual vulnerability review by security research at Flexera Software, analyzes the evolution of software security from a vulnerability perspective. So hopefully they'll analyze what CVEs apply to what code and all that sort of stuff. We'll obviously have them on to talk about that. Following that, Railroader, which is a security static analysis tool for finding vulnerabilities in applications that use Ruby on Rails. So that'll be fun. That's actually a third time for David A. Wheeler. He's been on for two other subjects. So man, three different guys. Do it a three-peat. Fluid Keys builds an OpenPGP. Builds on OpenPGP, makes it easy to implement great security across your organization. Edisync, which is secure end-to-end encrypted and privacy-respecting sync for your contacts, calendars, and tasks. Okay. Three new things added to the schedule. So just added between last week and this week, Mycroft, which is the world's first open source assistant. Mycroft runs anywhere on a desktop computer, inside an automobile, or on Raspberry Pi. So think of like Siri and Google Home and things like that, but as an open source application, which would be really, really interesting. Unfortunately, it says it runs anywhere, but doesn't run on a Mac yet. So I can't play with it yet, except it's at some sort of Linux kernel. Also just added to the schedule between last week and this week, Ionic, which is the Ionic framework, is the free open source mobile UI toolkit for developing high quality cross-platform apps for native iOS, Android, and the web, all from a single code base. Now, I sort of have a dog in this show because I'm really, really big on Flutter, so I'll be able to ask contrasting questions about how does this differ from Flutter and what's the primary language. It's probably not going to be Dart. I think it's probably JavaScript. JavaScript. Anyway, and also just added to the schedule, the Redis folks say that they've made some updates to their software. They were last on in July of 2017, but they said they've made enough significant inputs that they want to come back on the show and describe what's new. But it's basically a open source, BSD licensed in-memory data structure store, uses database, cache, and message broker. And it supports data structures such as strings, hashes, lists, sets, sorted sets with range queries, bitmaps, hyperlog logs, geospatial indexes, and I could go on and on. There's a lot of nouns there. Anyway, that's enough of that. You go to the big spreadsheet for this show, twit.tv/floss is where it's linked from. And if you have any other suggestions, please tell the project leader or the community coordinator to email me, merlin@stonehenge.com, which is on that page. You don't have to memorize that. We have a live stream at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, back to Wednesdays at live.twit.tv. We took a couple of questions from the chat room there. You can follow us at @FlossWeekly on Twitter. You can follow me at @Merlin on Twitter. And we have a plug from the home office. Hopefully this is still running. It's time for our yearly Twit survey, and we want to hear from you so that we can serve you better. Head over to twit.to/survey19 and be heard. I'm going to be at Scale next week in Pasadena.
just right around the corner there. So if you're at Scale, please come up and say hi to me. I'm running a Dart and Flutter BOF on Thursday night. I don't know exactly where. You have to look at the boards, but I'll be definitely around. I'm not really any place public for a little while after that. Oh, I will be in Philadelphia for, it's not KubeCon, it's something like that, something by the Linux Foundation. I'll be there for their annual conference, something about Kubernetes. Anyway, that's all the plugs I have. What do you have there, Jonathan?
Hey, so I'll mention you can follow me on Twitter at JP_Bennett. And then just recently, a Hackaday article over at hackaday.com went live. Hack My House. Raspberry Pi is a touchscreen thermostat. That one was a lot of fun. We tossed away the old thermostat and ran open source Linux kernel on Raspberry Pi with a touchscreen and mounted it there. Really cool project. You can go check out the write-up there at hackaday.com. And that's it for me. It's great to be here.
Cool. Thanks, Jonathan, for coming back to the show and helping me out and giving me a chance to breathe every once in a while instead of going constantly for an hour, which takes a lot of time. So pretty crazy stuff there. All right. So, well, that's all we really have to say. So we'll see you again next week on FLOSS Weekly.